Well, financial influencers on social media, or finfluencers, may be helping to fill a gap with providing accessible financial content for free. But how do users or viewers of that content judge the poster's credibility? And what role should social media sites or regulators play in monitoring the content? A new report by the CFA Institute looks into all of that and more. We're joined by Paul Andrews, Managing Director for Research, Advocacy and Standards with the CFA Institute. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon, Paul.
Real pleasure to be with you, Jacqueline. Thanks for having me.
So it was a really interesting and quite thorough report, Paul, looking at the content that is posted, what sort of makes it up, who it targets, what it tends to cover in terms of topics, all sorts of things. So I wonder if maybe just starting there with the types of posts that are going out there, the types of content that you're seeing that financial influencers or these finfluencers are providing.
Well, thanks very much. And I would say that what we found was the different levels of content that exists across various different platforms. And we looked at three primary social media platforms: TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. And they differ. And in some ways, they have some similarities. They provide some very, very helpful education in some cases. In other cases, there are pretty overt recommendations that are being made. And in other cases, there are some promotions that are happening. And it's not one or the other necessarily. It could be all three in some cases. And sometimes the disclosures about these recommendations or promotions are very, very clear, and sometimes not so much. And I think that's what has us a little bit concerned.
Yeah, on the disclosures part, we've got one of the graphs from your report, just taking a look at the proportion that did have disclosures and that didn't. So 3/4 of them didn't have disclosures, while a quarter did. So when you're talking about a disclosure, would that be whether if somebody was talking about a stock, whether they own that stock themselves, or whether they worked for a company that did that, the same sort of disclosures that we do here on BNN Bloomberg when we're talking with somebody, an investment professional about a particular company, we get them to do that sort of thing? Or is it also, who's paying them to talk about the content? Would that be falling into this disclosure category as well?
Yeah, it would be all of those things that you just mentioned, and whether they were being reimbursed for their efforts on the site, for example, whether they own the stock, what their credentials are, and things of that nature. So there are so many aspects to this new set of forums that we find a Generation Z seems to be gravitating towards.
Yeah.
And it's just really interesting.
Yeah, and it is interesting because you do see more influencers, not necessarily financial ones, but just influencers overall, disclosing when they are paid to, promote a particular product and they put ad. Mm-hmm. And I know there's some requirements around that and actually putting ad in their Instagram post or what have you. But what's the sort of clarity around when you're talking about a stock or something along those lines, more in the financial world? Are there rules and regulations around what should be disclosed?
Well, that's one of the challenges that we found, I would say, in the work that we did, because one of the aims of the piece was to look at what are the policy frameworks that exist around the world with respect to disclosures with finfluencers. And what we found is that there is not consistency around the world. And that's a challenge. And one of the recommendations that we make in the report is that we ask regulators around the world to work much more closely together to come up with a somewhat harmonized definition of what constitutes a recommendation. Because in most jurisdictions around the world, if you make a recommendation, there are requirements, and there may be some education requirements, there are certainly disclosure requirements, but because the nature of how that's defined in different countries isn't consistent, it's difficult because social media goes cross-border, of course. And that's one of the main challenges that we found in the report.
Yeah, I thought that was a really, interesting point. The fact that, yeah, if somebody posted something and it was okay in the country that they lived in, but not in another one, then yeah, that you can see the reasoning behind wanting to have that sort of cohesive framework, or at least definition there. I also thought it was interesting just talking about how people judge credibility of some of these posters. And it comes down to just, the number of followers that person happens to have, didn't it?
Right. That's exactly right. And that's one of the pieces of advice and one of the recommendations that we make in the report is to question what are the qualifications of the individual that you're following. And they may be perfectly qualified, but do they give you that information to demonstrate that they have certain qualifications to be able to make the promotion or make the recommendation? And then also asking the users, can that be verified?
Yeah.
And just following some basic, I would say, hygiene could go a long way.
Paul, just quickly, what's your sense of, how much urgency there might be to address this, to try to figure out that definition that, that goes across borders?
Well, I think there is urgency to this, and regulators around the world that we've talked to and policymakers are concerned, because this is a new cohort of investors, the younger generation, that this is one of their main vehicles in terms of entering into the financial markets. And I think we have an obligation to get it right. And so there is some urgency to do it. I think jurisdictions will differ, and there's always challenges with that, but we're calling on global regulators to really take this up in the very near future.